My name is Ahmed Shahid. On behalf of the Director of the Human Rights Center, Dr. Andrew Fagan, my colleagues in the Center's core team, I am delighted to extend a warm welcome to the moderator and speakers and to colleagues and students and the attendees at this virtual event. I also want to use this opening remarks to thank the speakers as my colleagues, Dr. Emily Jones and Dr. Katia Akatib and Sophie Conlon for organizing this fantastic event. This panel has been convened to highlight the importance the Human Rights Center attaches to International Day of Tolerance, observed annually on 16 November. Tolerance in this context is not a concession or indulgence, but the active acceptance of the diverse ways of being human, grounded on the universality of human rights, and as outlined in UNESCO's principles on tolerance. Societies are becoming more diverse through migration and globalization, while the internet has become the premier public forum of the age, further opening up spaces that are even more diverse than offline spaces. These trends create opportunities not just for a variety of exchanges, but also for self-expression and pathways to enrich our self-understanding, to build bridges, promote solidarity, and enhance our sense of belonging. However, these trends are also accompanied by increasing intolerance, including discrimination, hostility, and indeed violence based on our identities, leading to rising marginalization and exclusion of persons and groups of persons. These trends can be particularly alarming when those who are so targeted have historically faced discrimination. Today's discussion will focus on challenges faced globally in the protection and promotion of LGBTI+ rights. For decades, LGBTI+ rights have been marginalized, with states failing to recognize the full humanity of LGBTI+ people. While there has been much progress in the protection of equal rights of LGBTI people over the past few decades, there's no country in the world that fully respects and protects their rights. And normative development in this area still lags far behind. In today's panel, we will hear from a series of experts who are working broadly within the realm of LGBTI+ rights, both at the national level and international level. They will share with us the experiences of working in the field and the challenges they face, and also offer useful career advice. With these words, I will now hand over to Dr. Emily Jones, who will moderate the session. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Professor Shahid. I'm very proud to have been able to co-organize this event with you, especially also given your fantastic work on how the rights of LGBTI+ people intersect with freedom of religion or belief. And that's vitally important work that you do. It's always a pleasure to work with you. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Emily Jones, and I am going to be chairing this event today. And today we have a truly special panel of experts lined up for you who are going to give us some insights into some of the core issues that LGBTI+ people face, as well as kind of insights into what it is like to work in the field. So today we have joining us Dr. J Stewart, MBE and CEO and co-founder of Gendered Intelligence, Alma Aguila Bentancurt of IGLA World, and of course, an Essex Human Rights Centre alumnus, so extra special. Nice, thank you for joining us. And finally, we will have Catherine Dupreux-Debay, who is a Human Rights Officer at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. So I will give you a proper introduction to all of them before each speak, because of course they've all done many things and they have excellent biographies, and I will have to abbreviate those a little bit as well. And they will each speak for around 10 minutes, which I know is a bit short, but they're going to try their best to fit what they can in. But before I introduce our first speaker, which will be Dr. J Stewart, I wanted to just note a quick housekeeping rule. If you do want to ask a question, you can do so at any point in the event. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So you click that and you ask your question. If you want the question to be asked anonymously, then please, there's a little tab that says ask anonymously. You can ask a question at any time, but I will be asking the questions of our panelists at the end after all presentations are finished. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker for today, which is Dr. J Stewart, who is, of course, the CEO and co-founder of Gendered Intelligence, a really fantastic organisation, which we're very proud to be working with quite a lot at the University of Essex. So Dr. Stewart has been involved in the trans community since 2002, and in 2008, he co-founded Gendered Intelligence. He now oversees the main activities across the organisation in his role as CEO. Gendered Intelligence is a registered charity that provides activities, support, training and resources for trans communities and all those who work with or support trans and gender diverse people. Gendered Intelligence specialises in particular in supporting young trans people between the ages of 8 and 30. Jay has been involved in delivering on all aspects of Gendered Intelligence's work at one time or another, including working on multiple projects, as you can see in his biography on our event page. And he also sits on a wide range of forums and networks, such as the Parliamentary Forum on Gender Identity, the National Transgender Advisory Board for Trans Prisoners, and again, many, many more. See his biography again for more detail. Jay was awarded an MBE in 2014 in the New Year's Honours List for services to the trans community. And he has also published widely on the subject of trans culture, communities and equality. So without further ado, Dr. J Stewart, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Emily. That's a great introduction and nice to be here. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk for 10 minutes and just to say a little bit about my experience in the trans movement here in the UK. I came out as a trans person myself in 2001, 2002 and got really immersed really in the community. I always tell people that when I found my people, I also found my cause. So I think my message here is around the importance of lived experience and being from a marginalised community is certainly part of the solution to move the game on and move towards liberation for the community that I feel to be a part of. So just wanting to encourage people to get on board, get involved, and if you are a gender diverse person, then you can absolutely be part of the solution alongside our cis allies too. Back in the day, I also was involved in academia. I've been reading a lot of queer theory and I was involved in gender studies. And alongside that was involving myself in the community. And I guess what I noticed was that the trans community at that time was very embryonic. Excuse me, trans people are thinly spread, I think, with a small population. And I guess I was really keen to be involved in mobilising the community and also carve out a career for myself. And I think that's part of the mix as well. So just before I sort of move on, I just wanted to say what I mean when I use the word trans. People who feel that their sex or their gender that they were given to them at birth does not match or sit easily with their sense of self, may use the term trans to describe themselves. And when we always talk about trans being a descriptive term and something that is a label that we should be giving to ourselves rather than one that is put upon us. And trans is a very diverse term. Some people feel that they are the opposite to the gender that they've been given at birth, and so may use trans man, trans woman to describe themselves. Some trans people will go on to have medical intervention, and as part of this, the diagnosis of gender dysphoria is in the mix. And again, this language, I think, is quite political and important in our current times. But it's also important to say that there are many different ways of being a trans person, and people who would describe themselves as not a man or a woman, a boy or a girl, may use the term trans to describe themselves. And we tend to categorize people who are outside of the gender binary as non-binary identities. And some people feel that they don't even experience a sense of gender as well. It's also important to point out that gender is not independent from other aspects of our lives. So experiences of being white, middle class, middle-aged, educated and trans without impairments, for example, those experiences do get foregrounded, and experience and contributions of others are often not heard or recognised. I think it's really important to flag intersectionality and intersectional mindfulness when it comes to moving forward with marginalised communities. People with multiple exclusions make some trans people particularly vulnerable, for example, to poverty or homelessness. They may have a disproportionate effect around the health access that they have, or be victims of hate crimes as well. So I just think at Gendered Intelligence, we try to really foreground that there are no hierarchy of rights, and it really is a matter of support and access for everybody. Trans and non-binary and gender questioning people do face a number of significant inequalities. So these might be understood as kind of high levels of discrimination, shame, abuse and violence. We may experience greater inequalities with regards to our health and well-being, and that would include our mental health as well. There are higher levels of social isolation, exclusion and loneliness, and we may experience less opportunity in terms of education, training and employment. And my thoughts are that the causes of these inequalities are complex and they're multiple, but ultimately are underpinned by poor understandings of gender, a kind of reductive thinking about gender, and a reinforcement of the gender binary. And of course, the social pressures to conform to gender norms and the consequences experienced if you don't. So really, gendered intelligence is all about improving the lives of trans people through educating wider society to increase their understandings of gender diversity. We are a trans-led and trans-involving grassroots organisation and come with a wealth of lived experience, as I've suggested about myself. And we have lots of community connections and a depth and breadth of trans community knowledge that I feel is really quite powerful and makes a big contribution. But we believe that everyone can be intelligent about gender. So it's a rich topic and something that affects everybody. We all have a gender and we all have a relationship to gender. And we all know what it feels like to be restricted and constrained by those social expectations of gender norms that pervade our society. At GI, we imagine a world where gender diversity and diverse gender expression are visible and valued, and where trans, non-binary, gender diverse, gender questioning people live healthy, safe, and fulfilled lives. So our USP comes from the breadth and depth of understanding that we gain across our sectors. We've become quite a complex organisation doing a whole range of activities, which has been signalled by Emily previously. And I think it's this multiple perspectives ranging from grassroots youth work to participation in academic debate, from helping corporates becoming more trans inclusive, to working with the government and affecting public policy, to delivering frontline mental health services, working in the arts and heritage sector. And this complexity as an organisation, although it does present a lot of challenges, we feel contributes to our expertise. We learn from our members, especially young people. So what young people are saying about themselves, how they're describing themselves, what's kind of coming up for them is absolutely implemented in our learning across the organisation, and then becomes really valuable when we share our understandings, our learnings, our knowledge with organisations that are looking to be more trans inclusive. So I've been asked to touch upon what life is like in domestic UK and what the key issues are. People may know that the environment at the moment here in the UK is complex and challenging. But I think just to issue some context, I think this is going to be picked up broadly from fellow speakers. The law isn't a constant aspect to our lives. Rights are won, but also don't remain forever. Now is the time to not take anything for granted. There's also more to the law, and at Gendered Intelligence, we are interested in the societal shifts that we need to make. We need to celebrate gender diversity across society, and the law can play a part in that, but it's not the only thing. We need to ensure that public discussion is happening alongside legislative change. And so I really value the opportunity to talk here today, to hear from people around their thoughts. One thing that I wanted to flag really in terms of where we're up to is the demedicalizing of trans experience that is happening. And so with the reform, with the GRA reform being underway, at the heart of the debate, the discussion, was this principle of demedicalization and self-determination. So really where we are at culturally is to foreground self-declaration. Self-declaration means for a trans individual to say who they are and what their gender is, and to disentangle trans experiences from a kind of medicalized model of what it means to be trans. This kind of reform has taken place in Ireland, Malta, Norway, Colombia, many other countries, and the UK is falling behind on this matter of self-declaration. Scotland now is going towards self-declaration and leaving England and Wales behind with it. So just to sort of say in final comments, repeal of the diagnosis requirement in place of self-declaration means to venture towards a more depathologized model. And this is the direction of travel across the trans movement globally and here in the UK. From a human rights perspective, self-determination means to be awarded our civil rights and to have bodily autonomy. Self-determinism means to say, this is who I am, this is what I want, I decide. Liberty means that each person has ownership over themselves. No one has a higher claim on a person's life than oneself. And if we are to obtain trans liberation, it's really important for allies to stand up and be counted in relation to laws. And if there's a consultation or a campaign, just a final call for action from my side, which is to register your support for trans inclusive legal positions. And that's my 10 minutes. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stewart, really for your insightful presentation and also for that call. Yeah, we really do need much more kind of work in terms of legal solutions to support trans people. So thank you very much for that. Just a reminder, our audience, if you have questions, keep putting it in the Q&A button at the bottom. But I will now, of course, introduce our second panelist, which is Alma Aguilar Bentancurt of IGLA World. So Alma is a trans woman and human rights defender from Colombia, and she, of course, holds an MA in human rights and cultural diversity from the University of Essex. So we're very, very proud to have her back with us, albeit sadly online. She has a lot of experience in working in diverse regional and international organizations, such as the Organization of American States and the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association. Alma has experience engaging with the universal system of human rights protection through her work at ILGA World, and as a human rights defender in Colombia, where she has advocated for the human rights of Indigenous women with diverse and ancestral gender identities and expressions. She's currently the project officer of the Love Alliance at AIDS Fonds, a project that seeks to advance the sexual and reproductive health rights of LGBTQI persons, sex workers, and people who use drugs in 10 countries across the different African regions. So Alma, over to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Emily. Well, I have a short presentation that I want to share, if it's okay with everyone. Well, first of all, I want to thank my dear professors, Dr. Ahmed, Dr. Emily, Sophie, and well, all of the Essex team for organizing these spaces. I know how inspiring they are because, well, really not long ago, I was a student at Essex and I was listening to other LGBTI defenders who were amazing. So being here is truly a privilege. About me, well, my name is Alma Aguilar Bentancurt. My pronouns are she, her. I am a trans woman and a human rights defender from Aviala, Colombia. And I've mostly focused my work on queerness and decolonialism. And well, I made this presentation also because I wanted to honor some of the amazing queer women, human rights defenders that have inspired me and other LGBTI defenders. So you will be seeing some of them across these slides. So about the work that I do in the past 6 years, and well, after I graduated from Essex a couple of years ago, I've had the opportunity to work for different international organizations, such as the Organization of American States, the International Lesbian, Gay, Intersex, and Trans Organization, ILGA World, in their UN advocacy program. And currently I work for AIDS Funds, a Dutch NGO. And also, as Emily mentioned, I work with an indigenous community of trans women in Aviala, Colombia. Some of the things that I'm tackling through my work in suggest issues. Well, currently at AIDS Funds, I am project officer for a 5-year project called Love Alliance, which basically seeks to improve the sexual and reproductive health rights of key populations who, due to social barriers, have been more vulnerable to contracting HIV or AIDS, such as LGBT persons, sex workers, and people who use drugs. This alliance works in 10 African countries and is comprised by 9 partners that do advocacy at the global and regional level. And well, we provide funds to human rights defenders to fight for decriminalization, access to sexual and reproductive health related services. And also we aim at ending stigma, discrimination, and violence towards the key populations that we work with. One of our main goals in the program is to switch the power dynamics also between the global South and the global North, particularly when it comes to funding. And we do this through a series of principles that are agreed with our partners, who are all African and community-led organizations. At ILGA, I had the opportunity to also work for its UN program as an intern first, helping with matters related to special procedures and treaty bodies of the UN, and providing some assistance to defenders from different countries to engage with these mechanisms. And later, I worked as a consultant developing an online academy for LGBTI defenders who are not familiar with the universal system of human rights protection, so they can learn how the current IHRL framework has been used and can be used to advocate for their rights. And well, as I mentioned, I also work with an indigenous community of trans women in Colombia. And for me, providing support to this community has been one of the most amazing opportunities I ever had. And we have been basically advocating for their civil and political rights, as well as for their economic, social, and cultural rights, both nationally and globally. And we aim at being legally recognized as the first indigenous community of trans persons in Colombia and Aviala. And I use the term trans here because, well, unfortunately, due to colonization and the still close forward contact that we have with the Western world, this is the term that has been easier to work with. But this is not necessarily the term that the community recognizes themselves with. And they recognize themselves as being or having ancestral and diverse gender identities and expressions with their own terms. And well, to talk a little bit about this field of working in human rights, I have to say that this is the most gratifying field ever to work. And well, as I'm sure many of you know by now, it is not necessarily the one that will provide the best economic or migration stability ever. But I believe that these are things that are changing and that need to change for the future, and that have changed in the past years also. And I think personally, as a queer woman, and especially as a migrant queer woman of color in the global North, one of the things that we often overlook as defenders or as people doing advocacy is the importance that we give to rest and mental well-being. So one advice for me, especially for those of you who will be working in advocacy on issues that are related or directly affecting you and people like you, is to remember to, be kind to yourself and also to look after yourselves. And I don't say this necessarily in terms of productivity or as in like you need to take care of yourself first so that you can help others. But more in the sense that you deserve to be okay, and more importantly, you deserve to be safe, because working in these issues is not necessarily safe in all countries. And well, mostly when we work in gender LGBTI issues, the people that are working in these fields are normally the ones who have experienced the disadvantages and the human rights violations by themselves. And of course, we bring a lot of knowledge and we bring our lived experiences to this work, but this is also something that has an effect on us. And And well, yes, I think that generally that our lived experiences and more importantly, the love that we put into our work, and by love, I don't mean like romantic love or normative love, but I mean more community caring, must be the sources of the change that we do and the advocacy efforts that we want to do. Also, another thing that I would like to say to the people that are listening, particularly to students, is to keep in mind that the fights that we do through our advocacy will most likely take years or even generations to materialize in change. So these are not things that will just change from one day to the next. Well, another thing that I wanted to, maybe as an advice that I think is good, that I would have liked to listen as a student, is also to take advantages, if you want to work in this field particularly, of the benefits that you will get from being an alumni at Essex, and I'm sure other universities out there, and particularly when it comes to special visas that we can access, such as visas for recent graduates. Here in the Netherlands, where I'm currently based, they have that. They call orientation year visas. And it is good to have access to these, particularly for people coming from the Global South, because then they provide us access to works that otherwise we wouldn't be able to access, since most of these normally don't sponsor visas or help us in that regard because of the lack of funding. Some things that require attention in our work, I mean LGBTI rights and suggest advocacy. Well, I want to start with something positive. I think that there is increasingly more attention to queer perspectives to IHRL. And we see this also in the issues that are discussed in international fora. And I mean specifically how the IHRL framework has slowly started to include, for example, non-binary identities in the discussions that are held by special procedures, mandate holders, for example, or more broadly at the Human Rights Council and other international foreign mechanisms. And I think these shifts of paradigms are also a reflection of the type of advocacy done by queer defenders within different human rights mechanisms. And this shows us how IHRL is still alive and is constantly evolving, and that we have an effect actually in this, which is really important. Some other things that require attention, as you can see here, for me are funding. And by funding, I mean, and I think this is something that was also touched upon and that I hope we can discuss more later. I mean that grassroots organizations and human rights defenders all over the world need resources to continue advancing LGBTI rights, and especially, this is very important and true to the Global South. Access to resources and shifting the power dynamics in funding are both a historical debt inherited through colonization, because most of the things that we fight against, such as criminalization, for example, were actually brought upon by particularly colonialism. Other things that require attention are queer, decolonial, and anti-racist perspectives in the advocacy work that we do. And with this, I want to touch briefly on intersectionality, which is an important framework, of course, to understand the different and intersecting forms of oppression and violence and discrimination that different people can experience. But I think that it often also fails at looking at the root causes of these oppressions and at challenging them structurally. So I think that it's important because queer, decolonial, and anti-racist scholars have been saying this for years, and also advocates. And it's important to keep this in mind in the type of advocacy that we want to do and how we want advocacy for LGBTI rights to look in the future. Another thing that I think is very important to keep in mind is data. Well, as I'm sure many of you might know by now, there's in general a lack of data, especially due to criminalization, but also due to the lack of interest and responsibility of states for gathering data on suggest-related issues, which makes it hard for us to have an accurate picture of many things, such as how many cases of transphobic violence there are actually in the world. And this can make it harder for us to make the case for suggest rights in our advocacy work because of these gaps in data. And another important point to close briefly is decriminalization. This is something that is still an issue. And it's very important and it requires a lot of attention. So currently, as you can see in this map, this is something that we do at ILGA World, and the amazing research team updates this map annually. There are still 69 UN member states that criminalize consensual same-sex sexual acts between consenting adults and LGBTI persons more broadly through colonial inherited laws. However, unfortunately, de facto criminalization still occurs in most countries, and even in the global north. And by this, I mean laws or policies that do not expressly or necessarily are intended to criminalize LGBTI persons, but that in reality are used to do so, such as policies against sex work or drug use, which are some of the main causes for criminalization of LGBTI persons in countries where there's no de jure criminalization of LGBTI persons per se. And well, there are many other things that I think should be touched upon, such as the rise of discourses and narratives against trans persons, for example, which are increasingly being seen all over the world and which have an effect in the material realities of trans people, and of course in the advocacy work that we do. But I think I will leave it here because we're probably running out of time, and maybe it will be good for the questions later on. So thank you. Dear Emily.
Thank you so much, Alma, for that fantastic presentation. It's great to have obviously the post-colonial perspective in particular, but also really great to hear about all the amazing work that you've been doing since you left Essex. So thank you so much for that. I'm sure we're going to have many questions for you. But kind of from the domestic to the more transnational with Alma, and I'm now pleased to introduce our third speaker, which is obviously, she's obviously going to be taking a more global perspective. And that is, of course, Catherine Depreux-Debay, who is a human rights officer who has been working at the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights for the last 14 years. So she really has extensive experience here. She recently joined the OHCHR regional office for East Africa in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where she's the regional gender advisor. And between 2016 and 2021, she advised the mandate of the UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and provided substantive support to the mandate's activities. Prior to that, she worked with the various treaty bodies, the Universal Periodic Review, the Commission of Inquiry on Eritrea, the Humanitarian Funds on Torture and Slavery, and briefly supported the Tunisia Country Office. She was also involved in the treaty body strengthening process and has experience in providing technical assistance to states, delivering capacity building trainings and developing and managing IT-related projects. Of course, again, like all of our speakers, she has a much more extensive bio available on our website. But I will now like to hand the floor over to you, Catherine, when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily, and I would like to thank the Human Rights Center at Essex University for inviting me and for being part of this panel discussion, sharing the space with such amazing human rights defenders and trans activists. So really wonderful to be here. Thank you very much. So as you mentioned, actually, I'm going to give you a little bit an overview of my experience in the field of sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics through the lens of the United Nations, obviously. So as Emily was mentioning, I started working in the field of human rights in general 15 years ago. First working for the University of Bern, and then with OHCHR, with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And at the beginning, I worked really mostly on at the headquarters and on UN human rights mechanisms. So the issue of sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics has been mainly part of my work in the context of the analysis of implementation of international human rights norms by states through when, for instance, drafting concluding observations for states, when looking at the UPR, looking at commitments by states by different human rights mechanisms and so on. And since 2016, I had the chance to actually join the team. Well, actually, I was the first one supporting the mandate of the independent expert on sexual orientation, gender identity when the mandate was established. And I seized the opportunity to frame it more generally within the work of OHCHR, because the establishment of the mandate of the independent expert on sexual orientation, gender identity took place in a context where visibility to violence and discrimination based on SOGIASC was already one of the key work of the office. And the High Commissioner for Human Rights had issued actually 2 reports in 2011, 2015, that's really that were published and presented at the Human Rights Council, that enabled to give visibility to the lived realities of LGBT persons and to the wide range of human rights violations that they were facing. And therefore these led to the creation of the mandate of the independent expert. And so now at the UN Human Rights Office, the work of the office on advocacy, giving visibility to violations, monitoring cases, including through field offices, working with partners to advance the human rights of LGBT persons, and raising awareness, including through the Free and Equal campaign, continues in parallel to the work of the independent expert on sexual orientation, gender identity. So what is it like to work at the UN Human Rights Office to support the mandate of the independent expert? So I've been the main advisor of the expert. I was basically managing the team, the budget, and supporting, coordinating the team and supporting the mandate of the independent expert. I was involved in all the work of the independent expert. As you know, mandate holders are not paid staff. They are external experts that are independent and that are supported by usually one staff or one staff and a half at OHCHR. And they're here for 3 years, renewable once, so maximum 6 years. So as secretariat, what we do is really, we are the link between the mandate holder and the rest of the world, with states, with national human rights institutions, with civil society organizations, with victims of human rights violations, with other international and regional human rights mechanisms. We also ensure the institutionality and continuity, obviously, of the work between different mandate holders. And we provide substantive, but also logistical and administrative support to the mandate. And the mandate of the independent expert on sexual orientation, gender identity has exactly the same working methods as any other special procedures mandate holders. So basically communications, transmitting urgent appeal, allegation letters, and drafting letters on draft legislation policies to states, conducted fact-finding country visits twice per year, providing submitting thematic reports to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, and also to working on some thematic issues on the side. For the mandate of the independent expert, there's been 2 overarching objectives, which are to give visibility to violence and discrimination, and to support effective state measures. And giving visibility comes from the rationale that it's necessary to uncover the lived realities of LGBT persons, to be able to know actually first that they exist, because very often we know that some states actually even challenge the existence in some countries or some region of LGBT persons, but also knowing what human rights violations they are facing. So, and in addition, dialogue was really at the core of all the work of the independent expert. So most of our work was also to really reach out to different stakeholders and try to enter dialogue, including trying to identify opportunities for dialogue with those who don't necessarily support either the mandate of the independent expert on sexual orientation, gender identity, or just oppose advances with regard to SOGIASC. And so in terms of supports, I mean, really communications in general, I would say the great what is amazing about this work is that you talk with everyone. You talk with victims of human rights violations through communications. You during country visits, you meet with all stakeholders in a specific country to really have a complete overview of the human rights situation of LGBT persons. And you also talk with those who are opposing. So, for instance, faith leaders, some state officials who are really challenging in a way some advances. The challenges that are, can be seen, I would say, more generally at the global level, are obviously that there are still deeply embedded homophobic and transphobic attitudes a little bit everywhere. And as Alma was also mentioning, the lack of adequate legal protection and criminalization, still a reality in 69 countries, but also criminal laws used basically to repress LGBT persons a little bit everywhere. So there's still a very, very high level of violence against LGBT persons, especially against trans persons, and they're really facing still discrimination in all fields of life, from education to health, to work, to participation in public life, access to justice, and so on and so forth. But as Alma was mentioning, actually, one of the big issues is that very often we don't know, because there's a lack of data. And therefore, data gathering is one of the key recommendations that the independent expert has put forward, because we need to know to be able to adopt legislation and policies and measures, right? With regard to the independent expert, I would say one of the main challenges that that the mandate is facing is definitely the opposition to his mandate. You may know that when the mandate was established in 2016, there was a strong opposition for the creation of the mandate, with very heated and hateful debates at the Human Rights Council that really divided states. And some states were at that point accusing the Human Rights Council of creating new rights, or not recognizing and they were not recognizing the universality of rights. They're trying to, they thought that some states were trying to impose some cultural norms, some lifestyle, in brackets, obviously, that were foreign to their own. But when we see the debates and the adoption of the resolution for the renewal of the mandate, we see that there is a lot that has changed in between 2016 and 2019, and the debate was much more appeased. But this cultural war, as some call it, still rages, and is increasing in some parts of the world, as others mentioned previously. So there is really, and that's something that we could witness when working on the last reports on gender, is that we could really witness some exclusionary narratives that have gained traction in public debates recently that tend to dehumanize LGBT persons. And that's something that also can affect you when you work on these issues. And here I would like to also support what Alma mentioned. It can really take a toll on your health, on your mental health. It's really, you need to be kind to yourself, but to ensure also that you have proper provision for self-care and support systems, because at times, not only if it's not directed to you, but it's directed to, I mean, the awful violations that you see, the hate that you hear around you can really, really be difficult and very challenging. That's really for the challenges, but at the same time, as Alma was mentioning, I think we need to have a long-term vision. If you look at the past 20 years, there's been really great advances with regard to the human rights of LGBT persons. There are many states that have adopted measures to protect LGBT persons and promote equality. Just to mention a few, in terms of decriminalizations, there are more than 30 states that decriminalized in the past 20 years. In terms of legal gender recognition based on self-determination, we've been seeing great advances. Conversion therapies, the independent expert issued a report in 2020, and since then we've seen many states taking steps to end conversion therapies. Also in terms of data collection and the establishment of national plan of action to address the situation of LGBT persons. So really they are very positive things despite the overall environment and a lot of hate that we can still hear. And within the UN system, I think one of the key advances that we might see in the coming years is the adoption of a UN system-wide strategy on the human rights of LGBT persons that is currently being designed and hopefully will be endorsed soon. And that will have a huge impact on the work of all UN agencies, both for LGBT persons internally, so for staff, but also for the integration of the human rights of LGBT persons in the work and operation of UN agencies. So just a final word on what it is like to work on the issue. To me, working on this field has been the most rewarding experience of my career. I really feel that I've been able, and I'm still able to contribute to a topic where there is much that remains to be done. As we mentioned, very often LGBT persons remain the most excluded, the most marginalized, and they're very often seen as still as a sensitive issue, so difficult to tackle. But I think it's our duty, obviously, to make sure that no one is left behind. I loved working with the mandate holders that have been working on the mandate so far. It's been really an amazing experiences. I've deeply admired actually the mandate holders for the vision, expertise, strategic thinking, ability to engage in dialogue with all sorts of stakeholders. And most importantly, I think it's been extremely rewarding also to be able to engage with civil society organizations and LGBT communities. I've been really impressed by the expertise, the solidarity, the resilience, and the mobilization of the communities around the world to combat violence and discrimination based on SOGIASC. The strength of the movement can really move mountains, and I'm really impressed, and I have my deep admiration. And just a final word, I think states, other stakeholders and allies have also showed such a strong commitment that are deeply rooted in a way in the spirit of the International Tolerance Day, where active recognition of the universality of human rights and respect and appreciation of the rich diversity of forms of expression and ways of being human remind me of one of the first call of the first independent expert that was to embrace diversity in humanity. Thank you very much. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for your presentation and for your informative insights. It's both pretty terrifying but important to know about some of the backlashes we're facing at the global level in this area, but also really wonderful to hear about some of the advances being made too. So thank you for sharing. We now have time for some questions, and we've had a few come in. And I'm going to start off actually with two questions that come in for Catherine. So we're going to start off with that. And I want to link these together because I think they're quite related. So the first one comes in from Andrew Fagan, who is, of course, the director of the Human Rights Centre. And he says that he's very keen to hear more from Catherine on specifically how her team has engaged with critics and opponents of the SOGI mandate. And the second question, which follows on from this, comes in again for Catherine from Alexandra Brolimond, one of our brilliant PhD students. She asks, do you find you ever make any progress with these kind of opposed parties outside the confines of the UN? So thinking particularly about maybe when you go on country visits or speaking to faith leaders, for example. So in other words, are they receptive to what you say when you have a kind of more one-on-one interaction? So we'll start off with those, if that's okay, Catherine.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you very much for these great questions. I think really dialogue, as I mentioned, has been really at the core of the work of the mandate, and the independent experts managed to engage and to enter into dialogue, even with critics and opponents. Not all of them, obviously. Some that don't even recognize the mandate and don't want to speak with the mandate. So we have actually some that are refusing to engage. But even when refusing to engage, we managed to establish some strategies, also building some alliances with other mandate holders, so that in a way it's impossible to also not respond at all or not engage at all. So indirectly, I would say, even with those that really oppose to the mandate and say they would never engage, we managed to have some sorts of dialogue. And we've seen improvement in terms of denial. Some were really denying even the existence of LGBT persons on their territory at some point in time. And we've seen actually this rhetoric changed over time with more denying that there are any human rights violations against LGBT persons. So in a way, I think it's positive, and more, I mean, that's really with the hardliner. And then what we've seen, you had in 2016 really a block of states opposing the mandates. And this block of states deconstructed little by little, and we really managed to engage with many states that were part of the bloc, but I mean, basically, we're not necessarily really at the forefront. So, and as a proof, we can say, because you know that the Africa group in general was one opposing the creation of the mandate, but you can see that the independent expert had 2 country visits in Africa, one in Mozambique and another one in Tunisia, which is also a country that actually continues also to criminalize. So even if you oppose, if you were not, I mean, of the same opinion, I think there is always possibility to engage and to discuss. And with regard to faith leader, the independent expert always is trying to reach out to faith leader and engage with faith leader. He's been trying and has some success. And if I take the concrete example of country visits, when we go in a country, we always try to meet with the faith leaders, the main faith leaders of the main religions. And we managed almost always to actually meet the main. So we met the Orthodox Church, for instance, in Georgia, the Mufti, also some Mufti, the Chief Rabbi, and so on. And very often, actually, for some of them, it's been the first time ever that they spoke about these issues. So, and sometimes what we've seen is first kind of an opposition and quite difficult conversation, but little by little, the independent expert really managed to enter into a conversation around the issue, I mean, a human rights-based conversation, basically, around the issues of violations of that LGBT persons are facing, and also bringing some evidence, and not only misconception, myth, and so on, but bringing some evidence on the lived reality, and then in the end, really finding agreements around some basics in terms of protection for LGBT persons, and obviously there are some key issues that are more difficult to address, but around the issue, for instance, of arbitrary arrest, detention, torture, killings, and so on, I think there is definitely common agreement, and the independent expert was able to enter into a dialogue.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Catherine. I was wondering if Alma and Jay, if you wanted to come in here at all. I was thinking maybe Jay in particular, whether you kind of have also found face-to-face interactions to kind of show a bit more promise, because I know that's a big part of the work that you do, but also Alma, you might have some reflections too, but maybe we can hear from Jay first, and Alma, you can think about it if you want to respond.
I think as a trans person in this country, a leader of an organisation, it's always a dilemma around who you who you talk to and who you want to influence, and how much you want to be kind of platformed alongside someone who has an opposing view, not just a view, but a kind of an opposing view on who I am as a person. So that kind of experience, that lived experience, and feeling that there's an assault really against who you are as a person is always a challenge. I think it's always a dilemma, sort of when to engage and when to kind of say, actually, I'm not going to be framed in this kind of polarized kind of quote unquote debate. But on the whole, at Gendered Intelligence, you know, we're keen to increase understandings of gender diversity. So it's very important that we do offer a kind of face to a trans experience in this country, and dispel some, you know, of the misinformation and the myths and the stereotypes that individuals are just kind of holding on to, really, because that's been their main reference points, kind of growing up, the lack of opportunity to think about gender diversity, to talk to trans individuals, and also to learn about the context that trans people kind of live in, what the legal picture is, what language is used, what does inclusive practice look like. But most people that we engage with, certainly in the training room, they're just super keen, you know, to be on the right side of history here, to behave in an inclusive manner, to welcome people who have got different experience and identities to them. So we have to start, I think, in a place of good faith, and then when we're faced with some opposition or some kind of contrary, prejudicial, I would argue, positions, then, you know, you kind of have to take matters from there. But, you know, from my perspective, you know, having staff now, employees who I have a duty of care over, I have to think about what kind of experience of hostilities they have day to day in the workplace, and where it's just not acceptable to be putting people in front of prejudicial, bigoted kind of views. Really, it's a dilemma.
Definitely. Thanks so much for that. It's yeah, must be a really difficult thing to balance. Alma, did you want to come in on this, or do you want me to ask the next question? Do you want to come in on here? Yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe I think I have a couple of points that I can add. And I think particularly when it comes to faith leaders, it is good to recognize that not all faith leaders are actually against such as development or LGBTI rights. And I experienced that, for example, in the country visits that I had when I was a student at Essex, working with Professor Dr. Ahmed. And we went to Argentina and we met with faith leaders, and we saw how much progress we can do when we engage and we work together. So I think that is important also to keep this in mind, that not all the people that we normally tend to associate with you know, certain beliefs that are against LGBTI rights actually hold these views, and that progress can be made in that regard. And when it comes to challenges about making progress with opposing views, particularly working with people such as indigenous communities who are also trans, when you see other intersecting forms of discrimination happening, it is really hard then to engage in this kind of discussions. And I think particularly, for example, being a queer trans woman of color in the Global North, I realized also that sometimes it's also okay not to engage in these discussions, especially when it comes to discussions in which my identity is being questioned, because I don't think that there's a progress that needs to be made there, and that I just don't need to engage in a matter in which I have to stand up for who I am or my identity, because there's no progress that is going to be there done for me. And I think that I can better invest my energy in other things that can actually prevent others like me to experience this kind of situations. So I think that is also good to learn that not always we need to have this idea that we have to negotiate in terms of our oppressions or the violence that we experience, but that also it's important to recognize that through the discussions that we have with people who think different, we can grow, and that there are a lot of people who are willing to listen and learn, not only on SOGS rights, but also on queer and decolonial anti-racist rights. And I think that that's the way forward that I see for suggest advocacy, and these unions with the ones that are actually listening to us and willing to work with us are where the most added value is for us. So yes.
Wonderful, thanks so much, Alma. And we actually had a few questions coming in about how to balance personal identity with the work. So you and Jay have kind of answered that nicely for us as well. But we are unfortunately out of time. So I wanted to take this opportunity, obviously, to thank our fantastic 3 panelists for joining us, and to thank our students for coming and for the questions. And I also wanted to remind everyone who is based on campus or around campus at the moment, there is a vigil ongoing for Trans Day of Remembrance tomorrow evening on campus. It will be at 6 till 7:30 on Square 3. So do come along to that if you are available. It'd be great to see some of you there. I'll be there. But thank you so much to our 3 panelists again. That was really insightful, and thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. So have a good day as well. Thank you.